The tape stopped. Michael pulled off the headphones and said 3 words that made everyone in the booth look at each other. "It's the bass." The control room at Meridian Sound went silent, not the good kind of silence, where music hangs in the air like smoke. This was the tension kind, the kind that costs money. Through the thick studio glass, 12-year-old Michael Jackson stood in the vocal booth, one hand still gripping the headphone cable, the other pointing directly at the massive mixing console where Ray Morris sat surrounded by glowing VU meters and tangled patch cables. Outside, afternoon light fought through the single high window, turning dust motes into tiny planets. Inside, the air smelled faintly of solder and coffee that had gone cold 3 hours ago. Michael's brothers were scattered across the live room like pieces on a chessboard. Jackie leaned against the piano, his jacket draped over the bench. Tito sat on an amp with his Stratocaster resting across his knees. Jermaine stood near the bass rig, arms folded, while Marlon perched on a drum stool, spinning a stick between his fingers. They'd been tracking the same song since noon, a tight, syncopated funk number with a bass line that walked like it had somewhere important to be, and a hi-hat pattern that ticked like a bomb. The horns had nailed their parts in 2 takes. The rhythm section locked in on the first pass, but Michael kept missing the same 16-bar section, the pocket where his vocal had to slip between the hi-hat and snare like thread through a needle. Tommy Reeves, the session producer, leaned forward in his leather chair and pressed the talkback button. The speaker crackled. "Michael, we've been over this part 11 times. You know the melody, you know the rhythm. What's going on?" Michael's voice came through the monitors, calm and steady, almost apologetic. "I know the melody, Tommy, but I can't hear the hi-hat click when the bass guitar plays that low E. It disappears." Tommy glanced at Ray Morris, the engineer who'd been running sessions at Meridian for the better part of a decade. Ray's hand hovered over a row of faders. He'd worked with Motown acts, Atlantic legends, virtuoso players who'd spent decades in studios. But a 12-year-old stopping a session to complain about frequency masking, that was new. Ray pressed his own talkback. "Michael, I'm looking at the meters right now. The bass is sitting in the deep lows. The hi-hat is way up in the bright highs. They're not even in the same neighborhood. There's no overlap." "Not on the meter," Michael said, stepping closer to the glass. "In my ears. When they hit at the same time, the bass covers up the hi-hat click. It's like—" He paused, searching for the right words, his face scrunched in concentration. "It's like when you try to see a star next to the moon. The star's still there, but the moon's so bright you can't see it anymore." Ray's hand froze on the fader. He'd heard of psychoacoustic, masking. Hell, he'd read about it in textbooks back when he was apprenticing at a studio in Detroit. It was the phenomenon where a louder sound in one frequency band could make a quieter sound in another band harder to perceive, even when they were technically separated on a spectrum analyzer. The human ear didn't process sound the way machines measured it. But for a kid to not only identify it in real time but explain it with a metaphor that actually made sense, that was something else entirely. Tommy rubbed his face with both hands. Studio time at Meridian wasn't cheap. The clock on the wall, a big round industrial thing with a crack in the glass, read 3:52 p.m. They had the room booked until 6. After that, a jazz quartet had the slot, and those guys didn't mess around with delays. They still had 2 more songs to finish vocals on, and if Michael kept stopping every few bars, they'd be lucky to get one done. "Ray," Tommy said, his voice tight. "Humor him. Check the cue mix." Ray sighed and pulled up a secondary meter that showed the headphone feed Michael was hearing. The bass guitar sat fat and round in the low end, exactly where it was supposed to be. Thick enough to feel in your chest, tight enough to stay out of the kick drum's way. The hi-hat lived way up in the highs, a crisp, metallic tick-tick-tick that cut through everything else like a knife. On paper, it was textbook, but Michael wasn't listening to paper. Jackie pushed off the piano and walked toward the vocal booth, his hands in his pockets. "Mike, maybe you're just tired. We've been here since lunchtime. You want to take a break? Get some air?" Michael shook his head, firm but not stubborn. "I'm not tired, Jackie. I know what I'm hearing, or what I'm not hearing." He looked past his brother directly at Ray through the glass. "Can you turn the bass down, just in my headphones? Not in the final mix. I know that has to stay where it is, just in what I'm hearing." Tito leaned over to Jermaine and muttered, "Here we go again." Jermaine smirked. "Remember last month? The tambourine." And before that, the backup vocal, he said, was leaning flat. And he was right both times. Marlon spun the drumstick one more time and caught it. "Kid's got ears like a bat." But here's the part you can't miss. It wasn't arrogance. Michael wasn't trying to show off or prove he was smarter than the adults in the room. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his expression almost sheepish, like he was embarrassed to be causing trouble. He just wanted to sing the part right, and to sing it right, he needed to hear it right. Tommy leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "So, what exactly do you want, Michael?" "Just turn the bass down a little," Michael said. "Just in my cue mix, not much. Maybe—" He held up his thumb and forefinger barely an inch apart. "This much." Ray looked at Tommy. Tommy looked at the clock. The brothers looked at each other. The minute hand had crept past 4:15. Less than 2 hours left, and they'd barely finished one song. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Ray sighed, reached for a small rotary knob labeled TUEA, the control that fed Michael's personal headphone mix, and turned it counterclockwise. Barely a hair. Maybe a millimeter of rotation. On the meter, the bass level in Michael's feed dropped by less than 2 decibels. Technically, it was almost nothing. Practically, it was invisible. The kind of adjustment that most people wouldn't notice if you told them it happened. Ray hit the talkback. "Try it now." Michael slipped the headphones back on, adjusting them carefully so the pads sat flush against his ears. He closed his eyes for a second, listening to the room tone. The faint hiss of the tape machine, the hum of the console, the barely audible rush of the air conditioning. Then he nodded once, a small dip of his chin. Ray pressed the red button. The reels on the Ampex started turning, and the track roared back to life. Drums first. A tight snare hit, followed by the kick, landing like a heartbeat. Then the bass came in, walking that low E like it owned the street. The hi-hat started its relentless tick, and the horn section stabbed in with a phrase that sounded like a question somebody didn't want to answer. Michael stood perfectly still, his head tilted slightly to the right, as if he were listening for something just beyond the edge of what anyone else could hear. His brothers had seen this before, the way he could lock into a groove so completely it looked like he'd been born inside the rhythm. The syncopated section approached. 16 bars where the melody had to weave between the hi-hat and the snare, landing in the pockets most singers would miss entirely. His mouth opened. His voice came in clean, precise, riding the beat like a surfer on a wave. No hesitation, no missed cues. Every syllable landed exactly where it needed to be, dancing around the hi-hat click with the kind of timing that made it look effortless even though everyone in the room knew it wasn't. When he hit the final phrase, his right hand came up, one finger pointing straight at the ceiling, and Jackie grinned because that was the signal. That meant the take was good, that meant they had it. Ray stopped the tape. The room went quiet again, but this time it was the good kind of silence. The kind where something just worked and nobody wanted to ruin it by talking too soon. The clock on the wall read 4:47. 1 hour and 13 minutes to finish 2 more songs. Tommy leaned forward and hit rewind. The reels spun backward with that distinctive Ampex whine, and when the tape hit the start marker, he played it back. Once, then twice. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. No notes, no corrections. Flawless. Jackie stepped into the control room, shaking his head slowly, a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. How does he hear stuff like that? Ray didn't answer right away. He pulled off his own headphones, big studio cans that had probably tracked 1,000 sessions, and set them carefully on the console. He stared at the single knob he'd barely touched, the one labeled QA, the one that controlled Michael's personal headphone feed. "I've been doing this for 15 years, he said quietly, and I have never, not once, seen someone that young diagnose a psychoacoustic masking issue in a live Q mix without even knowing the technical term for it." Tito appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed. So he was right? Ray turned and looked through the glass at Michael, who was now sitting on a stool, sipping water from a paper cup, completely unaware of the small earthquake he'd just set off in the control room. He wasn't guessing, Ray said. He knew exactly what was wrong, and he knew exactly how to fix it. He paused, then added quietly, almost to himself, "I don't know where that kid's headed, but I guarantee you, 10 years from now, people are going to be talking about this session like it was history." Tommy stood and stretched, his back cracking audibly. "All right, people. We've got 2 more songs, and about an hour of daylight left. Let's keep this train moving." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "And next time Michael says something's off in the mix, we check it first and ask questions later. Agreed?" Ray nodded. He picked up a pencil, one of those yellow number 2s with the eraser chewed down to nothing, and made a note on the track sheet in neat block letters. Q mix bass, 2 dB per artist request. Then he circled it. Twice. 3 times. He wanted to remember this. The session rolled on. The next song went faster. Michael nailed the lead vocal in 3 takes, the harmonies in 2. By the time the clock hit 6 and the jazz quartet started hauling their stands and charts into the lobby, they'd finished all 3 tracks. When Michael walked out of Meridian Sound that evening, his jacket slung over one shoulder, he didn't mention the bass again. Didn't bring it up to his brothers, didn't ask Ray if the adjustment had been the right call. He didn't need to. The tape had already answered for him. Years later, long after the gold records and the stadium tours, long after Michael Jackson became a name that meant something to people who'd never set foot in a recording studio, Ray Morris would tell the story. He'd tell it at industry panels, in interviews with audio magazines, to young engineers who thought they'd heard everything and seen it all. He described the afternoon a 12-year-old stopped a session and rewrote everything he thought he understood about listening. Not hearing, listening, the difference between what the meters measure and what the ear perceives. The invisible space where music actually lives. And every time he told it, he'd finish the same way, his voice going quiet, his eyes looking somewhere past the person he was talking to. The machine can measure sound, but Michael Jackson could feel it. That's not something you learn from a textbook, that's not something you can teach, that's just... He'd pause, searching for the word. That's just the difference between good and great. And that kid, he was already great. The tape doesn't lie. And on that afternoon in a studio that smelled like solder and old coffee, it told the truth.